Thank you very much for everyone to actually come here and be here in person. It's great to see all of you. A great honor to present our work today. Also, thanks to everyone who's on the live stream and watching and spending their time with us virtually. I want to present today what we've been working on at Verisian. And at this point in time, I think it can be best summarized by this title, which is why we chose it, which is that we're working with traceability and AI for better understanding, communication, and QC of trials. That is the tactical stage, as Richard was referring to. But I'll drop a few hints at the strategic outlook as well. So all of this for us started with a very basic question, which also Richard already hinted at, which is why can't we release a drug immediately after the last pivotal trial, or as I would like to say, as soon as the science is actually done? And we have conducted a lot of interviews. I think we're now at 600 and plus across the industry, across the great variety of stakeholders that participate in this. And the answer is that, well, the process is just massively complex. And there's an intense number of stakeholders that have to communicate, very often across the borders of companies, parts of the organization. And so it's just complicated. That's one of the answers. However, a lot of these processes have developed over time, of course, which, during the time they developed, there were technical limitations which no longer exist. Some things were decided and tried out, and they kind of stuck and may not be optimal. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? Now, what I like to do in these situations is just to zoom out as much as possible and just think about the absolute fundamental truth of what we're doing here, which is that really the challenge is to understand data and code and how they interact. So why do I say that? It's because we're going to make the ultimate decision of whether something is efficacious and safe based on data that we transform and then outputs that we generate. And based on those, we're going to make our decisions. That's really what this is about. So once data are actually collected, what is a clinical trial? Well, it's data, analysis code, and then our outputs or TLFs in this case. And so what we've done is we've expanded on this core by adding the data standards, which have certain advantages. So we all know roughly which data can be found where. We are now, across the industry, fairly standardized, putting aside the fact that, of course, you can interpret data standards in a variety of ways, and there's a lot of leeway and creativity, which is the way it will always be with data standards. At least we roughly have a common organization. On top of that, the standards capture the data statically, of course, but the meaning of data is actually not in the data itself. It's usually in the transformations that generate the data. So the answer for what age actually is in a DM dataset can be very boring, but there are different interpretations. You can calculate it differently, and in that case, it means something different. So because of that, we have additional documentation. So we have the SDRG, ADRG, define-xml, and all of those are trying to capture this additional information. And if you look into the IGs, it literally says, well, this is basically duplicated information. It's derivative information. You're trying to describe what's in the code. The code is trying to describe what's in the SAP. You're trying to refer back to what's in the SAP. It's just a different view on the same thing. And it's there for communication. That's what it's there for. So why data standards? As I said, well, we've standardized it so we roughly know where stuff is. It gives us a structural understanding of the data. And what we say with manual metadata traceability is basically, well, you write down what you've done, which is sort of what the SAP is about, what you're going to do, and then you write it down again at the end when you submit, which hopefully is still consistent with the SAP and what was actually implemented. And it's just for communication. So if you now go to any kind of meetings like this, you'll see a lot of the industry presenting the problem space like this, which is that in a study, there's a number of derivations that you have to do, and most of these are common or they're standardized. So let's say that's the boring part. And some people will claim 70%, some people will claim 90%, and there's only this small little bit which is study specific, which will always be there. So we're in medicine. Let's all hope that medicine doesn't stop. There'll be continuously innovation, new ways of gathering data, new ways of analyzing it, new study designs. So this is the ever-moving edge. It should never disappear. It will never disappear. Otherwise, we really have a problem. And this, by definition, is not covered by standards, right? It's the edge. So by the time something is standard, it's fairly boring, and everyone knows what it means, and therefore, you don't have to worry about it much. Now, I'm going to put this into quotation marks because all of this stuff can be automated. So theoretically, yes. There are very few companies actually who have the resources and have so far had the time to properly automate this. And even those will admit, well, the vast majority of what can be automated is automated, but not all of it yet. That is to say, though, anyway, of course, it's useful to invest in this because then you don't have to worry about it anymore. The point being, however, that if you look at the workload and the actual problem of you doing the work, so where all of the actual thinking happens, where it's not so standardized that everyone knows what you're doing anyway, which means those are the points where you have to communicate and align with regulators, well, that's obviously in the part that's not standardized. And that's usually in the domains that actually matter for decision making. So the lower part is the way I look at the industry. So what's a clinical trial? It has a structural component, which is there for ease of organization and communication. And it has the content component, which is very, very hard to understand. So that's why there's a specific job description for people that do just that. And therefore, by definition, they become a bottleneck. The analysis code, however, is the source of truth of content of what happens in the study. It reads in the data, so you have a reflection of what the data actually looks like. It contains all of the transformations. It produces all of the outputs. And as Richard shows, if you do know what SAS uses or R for the final output, then it actually tells you which statistical test was applied and how, and therefore you know what it means. Of course, I'm just going to keep spouting sort of the obvious thing. We're going to make decisions on the content of the study, not on the structure, right? We make decisions on whether the drug is or the treatment is effective and whether it's safe, not on whether your SCTM is in accordance with guidelines. But the structure is, of course, immensely useful. Most of the content, however, that is used for decision making falls into this non-standard study-specific scientific innovation category. So we have to do something about this. And the core of our technology that I would like to present today is what we call code traceability, which is a way to trace the content interactions between data, code, and the results. And just to be very clear, this is independent of standards. So it is applicable also to real-world data. It is applicable to older studies that were done before the CETA standards were around. And it's also independent of languages. So we're starting with SAS because it is the de facto industry standard. Very few companies, again, have had the resources, motivation, and persistence to push R close to submission or even to submission. But it is, everything that I'll show you is directly transferable to R. It is also transferable to Python or whatever your favorite language might be in the next 3 to 5 years. Code traceability, by definition, because it looks at code, covers everything that is done in code. It doesn't matter if it's part of the standardized stuff, the common derivations, anything that's in code is covered. All you need to establish this code traceability are, in the case of SAS, the logs. In the case of R or other languages, just the code. So for SAS, the way it works right now is you execute your code, you turn on a couple of options like inference so that we can resolve macros, and you throw it into our platform. And what happens is that every single line of code gets analyzed. Every format, every variable, every data set, every code list applied, all of these transformations we capture, and we put into a very large data structure, which happens to be a graph. And if you were to look at this, it would be absolutely and entirely overwhelming because it's literally like looking at every single piece of information that's contained in every line of code, which is impossible to understand and impossible to navigate. The point then, of course, becomes how do we slice this, all of this information, to answer questions that you have and make this useful. So a quick demo to give you an indication for what this looks like in real life. If you want to try this out, you can go to demo.verisian.com. Everything that I'll show you is freely available there for you to play around with. This is a demo study, so it's a fake one. We generate the data ourselves, but it illustrates how it works, and it works identically even with larger studies. We have phase 3 trials. So like just in terms of volume, much larger trials in here already. So just to give you an idea, and more details will follow in the presentation. Let's say you're interested in a result. The way this works is that on the right side, we'll show you the graph, which contains that abstraction layer, which is useful for what you're asking about right now. And on the left side, we show you the code, which is the source of truth from which we generate and do everything. So if you look at the live test proc here procedure, we'll highlight the code that generated the procedure, and we will show you which data sets are required to produce this output. Now, this is fairly easy now because it's all in one file, and you're like, well, that's obvious. But what's interesting is that we can now expand and say, okay, I want to know everything about this data set, which is what I just did. And whenever you select a data set, it will jump exactly to the code that generated that data set. And if you keep going on this, you'll see that ADSL goes in here and ADEF. So let's just keep expanding this. And because I've done this a few times, I roughly know what the graph is going to look like. We can keep doing this until we reach SDTM level, and ultimately until we reach the raw, our source data, which is back here. So we've just traversed within a few seconds 7 files, several thousand lines of code, and you will only be shown exactly the lines of code which are required to produce this output. The abstraction layer that I've just shown you is datasets. So you click on a dataset, you see the code that defined the dataset. Now, obviously, all of you are like, can we do this for variables? And guess what? Yes. The point here is that for an output, of course, you don't usually throw in the whole data set. Like you have your atom level, and then you pick out a couple of variables, maybe 3, depending on your test. And this is what you're interested in. And so what we could do is quickly jump to another module, which is the results validation, because it shows it in a bit more focused way. So we grab all of the outputs generated in this demo study. You can select them. It will tell you which variables go into this result. It will display the result. Soon there'll be quite a bit more information that we display on top of it. But let's say you're interested in TRTPN, which is one of the main variables that goes into this output. You select it and you get the variable level trace, which means now you only look at the lines of code which are required to produce that variable. So we cut it down again from searching across files and maybe showing 900 lines of code down to 25. And you can do this variable by variable. So the amount of information that you have to process when you review something is incredibly much lower. The other thing that the results validation contains is that it's integrated with the data itself. So you can look at the values of the data as it is transformed. So for example, the source, you can have a view of what the data looks like on source level, at SCTM level, and then ultimately at the level where it goes into the result. Now, this is just to give you an idea of what code traceability means. It's already extremely useful for certain use cases. For example, let's say you're a statistical programmer and you go into a study that you're not familiar with and you have to do root cause analysis. I don't know how it is for you guys. I've written a lot of code in my life, even looking at my own code that I wrote 3 months ago. Occasionally it's difficult. I might not remember everything that I've done, and I would have actually loved to have this while I was still doing analyses. But in addition to that, of course, if you look into other people's code, if you look at a study that's a bit older, maybe you join a new company and you don't know exactly how things are done there. This obviously massively increases your speed in terms of onboarding. But let's look at some other use cases. So where's the value in this? The way to think about the traces that I've just shown you is that this is just a demonstration of what we're doing. Now the question is, what value can we generate from it? Now, obviously I have to talk AI because it is 2024. What is really important though, if you don't take anything else away from this AI piece of the talk, it's that we're not just using a big LLM like ChatGPT, grab your data, forward it, use a massive context window and hope that the reasoning capabilities get better, because they're very bad in detail. They're very good in general, they're very bad in detail. So how can we improve this? So what we're doing is we're doing traceability-enabled AI. I'll show you a little bit what that means in a second, and everything that we generate will be able to provide you the full evidence. Not evidence like ChatGPT, which starts making up references to papers, actually the actual evidence from which we generate the answers. So let's talk about LLMs really, really quickly. They are fundamentally sophisticated autocompletes. So what they do is they read in a token stream, they predict the next one. They read in the token stream they just generated, they predict the next one. Over and over, very, very fast. So most of the time, this will make sense. And that's obviously good. That's what we want. Some of the times it's a bit weird, and unless you're reading a fantasy novel, this sentence you might feel a bit off, but it's not wrong. Like you know, it does make sense in some context. So this is where it gets into the gray zone. Now, the real problem is, this is a real paper, I'm not making this up. Bullshit is also a real philosophical term, coined by a guy called Frankfurt in Princeton. He actually has a nice book on it, by the way, if I can give a recommendation on that one. The real problem that we have is that LLMs are actually really, really good at sounding like they're exactly right. And they're really, really good at being wrong anyway. And we're in an industry where that is not so funny. If you're in content generation, you're trying to gain more followers, and I don't know, 20% of your pixels are a bit off of the image that you generated, who cares? If you're wrong here, it's not funny. So how can we gain confidence in AI in this industry and make it actually useful? Not a POC, but actually useful. One of the answers is that we solve the same problem for the AI that we solve for you. So if I ask you a question about 20,000 lines of code and we say, you know, Andrew, how was that variable defined? And you have to go through 20,000 lines, the probability that you make mistakes is actually fairly high because you get confused and you get tired, and you might just, or it takes you a really long time. For the AI, it's the same thing. If it has to go through a lot of information to summarize it, the more information it goes through, the less accurate it gets. It's just information density, basically. And so what we do is we supply the AI not just with all of the code of the study or just the SAP, we supply it exactly with just the code that it needs to answer that question. And so we cut it down from 700 lines to 30, just like for you. And we know that the lines that we give to it are relevant. And not only do we do that, we actually enrich the information we give to the AI so that it doesn't have to do the reasoning through traceability. So we can tell it, this depends on that in this way, and we sort of enrich the prompt that way, fully automatically, so you don't have to type it up, because you wouldn't be able to. It would take you more time to type up the prompt than to figure it out yourself. So the AI, like I said, instead of looking at 730 lines in our toy demo study, we'll have to look at only 30. So traceability-enabled AI, it's reproducible because it is based on our static analysis of code, which doesn't change, and it's evidence-based because you can always access the evidence that it used. So let me run you through how this works. You ask a question. So we have several applications of AI. All of them are based on the same thing, but I think the best representation of this is the chatbot idea, which everyone is most familiar with. So you would ask a question, how's the time to event determinant of the study? That passes on to our first part of the system, which is an LLM, plus a little bit more, but that gets too complicated. We extract the clinical concepts that you asked about. It knows about CDISC, so it knows which variables and which data sets usually contain information about these clinical concepts. It runs through your study, pulls out the relevant traceability information, puts all of that together into a nice information sandwich and hands it over to the next LLM, which then produces its output. And part of the output is always that the evidence that it used to create that output is freely available to you and easily browsable. So the reason why it's deterministic, or as close to deterministic as you're going to get a probabilistic AI system, is because the foundation for which it uses to generate the answer comes out of our static code analysis, right? So if we run the same analysis on the same code base, we always get the same answer. If we run our algorithm about trying to figure out how age is actually derived, we always get the same answers. The evidence is always provided, and just again to be very clear, because some people sort of miss this, is that the answer that you get is study specific because it's pulling the code from that one study that you're working on. This is not a general system that roughly knows about CDISC or that roughly knows about how studies are done at AstraZeneca. It is looking exactly into your study, exactly into that variable, and is pulling that information. So then the evidence, how do you explore that? Well, I just showed you one of the interfaces, which is that all of the evidence that goes into the answer you can then explore through our tracer. So if you get an answer that makes you uncomfortable, it may be wrong. It may also be right. And if it's right or if it's wrong, you can very quickly assess whether it's right or wrong and how it is right or wrong. And if it indicates a problem in your code, we can very quickly hint at you how you should be fixing it. So if we now put this together again into another use case, or let's really start thinking about the use cases. So knowledge transfer is a huge problem here. It's literally one of the basic problems that we have in the industry. Handing in your submission to regulators is a knowledge transfer activity. It's a study understanding activity. But also all the handovers within your organization, that's the same thing. You're a programmer going to a new study, you're trying to communicate with medical writing, you're trying to communicate with your statistician. And it's really fun in a way because it's across many stakeholders, it's across companies, if CROs are involved, often it's across several, and ultimately you still have the interface to the regulators at the very end. And so one of the basic ones is, we'll move to this one quickly, is the tracer itself. So if you're onboarding onto a new study, this is a very, very quick way to figure out how specific parts of the study were done. And this one, I don't have to reiterate, I've said it several times. Now what we found is that in real life trials, like phase 3, really big ones, if you try to figure out how something was done in a study that you're unfamiliar, let's say you have a question about an atom level derivation, even complicated ones, our current best estimates coming from the people that we work with, so we're not making up these numbers, is that 95% of time is saved to figure out how something was programmed in a study that they're unfamiliar with. But knowledge transfer goes beyond that. So it's not just statistical programmers moving into studies that you're unfamiliar with. It's also about how do you communicate this to other stakeholders. So how about we work on a natural language interface that allows you to ask questions even if you don't know code. And this is, sort of the setup of the AI section, which is that we have a study chatbot, to whom you ask these questions. It extracts the clinical concepts, finds the traceability information, and then uses that to answer your question. And the answer here is actually a real extract from our system. And what I want to highlight at this point is that what we're doing conceptually is that we turn the AI problem from a reasoning problem, because if you just give it code, it reasons through the code, it tries to understand it, whatever that means actually, into a translation problem. So we let it translate from code language into natural language because we take out all of the reasoning and we supply all of the metadata and traceability information in the prompt itself. So yeah, that's just, let's say, meta information about how this works. Again, this is traceability aware and evidence-based. So if you hit this little icon down here for any answer that you get, again, you can explore all of the evidence that was used to generate the answer. Now let's talk about something else, which I am particularly passionate about, which is the elimination of double programming. Richard sort of did a setup already. And so double programming, everyone knows how this process works, right? So the basic assumption is that if two people independently program the same thing, at least conceptually, and you get the same outputs, then the probability is very high that it's correct. Now, be that as it may, I think there are a lot of arguments to be made against that, but still it is a process that has developed. It has developed for very good reason because the quality control requirements are extremely high. However, this is the only industry doing it. It's not the only regulated industry on this planet. For example, I'm scared to death of airplanes. I have to get on them all the time. That's also regulated. The airplanes don't crash all the time. There's no double programming involved. Others are using proven data and software engineering processes, using modular and tested pipelines. There's lots of other things that you can do. And what we have seen, especially through open source, is that proper review and then fast iterations just trumps double programming in terms of quality. It is both faster, and the more iterations you go through, the higher the quality gets. The other thing that we've learned is that the more eyes are on the problem, the greater the probability of you catching problems. If you have 6 people looking at the same problem, it's actually better than having 2 people independently program the same thing. And so with this concept, there are a couple of other advantages which I just want to quickly highlight. But what we're trying to do with Verisian, and I'll show you in a second how, is that instead of doing the double programming paradigm, we want to move things to this idea of peer review, basically, peer review coding. Well, no, that's the wrong way of putting it. One person coding it, having other people review, provide feedback, and then go through iterations quickly to raise the quality. This has some interesting side effects, by the way. So one is that you get free upskilling of your workforce, because now there's an exchange. We've had unbelievable amounts of calls with programmers that have told us that they have never had a code review, like a proper code review in their life, which is unbelievable, coming from a software person. Unbelievable. The rate at which people learn once they get code reviews is exponential, because you basically download all this experience from other people who've done this a lot more than you. And the fact that there are people that go through their entire career without ever getting proper feedback is unbelievable. That is a much greater quality risk than you can possibly get rid of with double programming. The other thing is that you increase the consistency across the organization. So a big part of what we do in our company when we write code is we have to make sure that it's consistent. Because if Andre gets sick, Aaron might have to look at it. And everyone knows that problem, right? And if Andre writes completely different code than Aaron, then what are you going to do? Well, you're just going to waste time. And we hear this from stakeholders all the time. It's about consistency. You know, like how do you want as a company to do your analyses? So this is what we're aiming for. However, I have to admit something, which is that in data analysis, it's quite difficult to do this because there's a really tight integration between code and data. Software is a little bit different. Nonetheless, and in addition, like we're actually doing fairly complicated stuff, right? So we're not just counting clicks or doing basic ETLs like a lot of other streaming platforms. But the question then becomes, how do we move the industry with its specific issues towards quality and speed while eliminating double programming? And we're working on a set of modules here. They are all based on code traceability, not surprisingly. And one of the things that we want to focus on first is specification validation. So generally speaking, you program according to specifications, which means that for every variable in every data set, you roughly have an idea or description of what this should represent. Now, what we can do is we can run through your code and we can pick out all the variables and all of the domains, and we can get the traceability information for them, obviously. And then we have our AI go into the description and then go into your code and do a delta and say, okay, what was specified is actually programmed or not, or to be fair, the AI is not sure. But we put all of this into a workflow, and this is roughly what it would look like. You would get the specification itself, you would get an AI summary of what was done, you will get a series of comments of whether or not this is actually a match, so it was programmed as it was supposed to, or, well, it wasn't, or the AI is not sure. So for everything that we do, I like AI as a technology. I don't trust it very far, which means that we'll always provide confidence scores of the AI. So if it's very complicated, the derivation is very, very long, and we just can't call it, our platform is going to say, we can't call it. We're going to give you indications, but you're probably going to have to review this yourself. Any of this sort of review cycle that we go through in all of our modules is fully integrated with like a discussion section and also with an issue tracker across the whole study, so that as issues arise, no matter where they come from, be it code quality, log quality, P21, all of this is going into one issue tracker. And again, obviously, you can review any of the AI calls using our code traceability. Now, there are a couple of other things that I want to go through, maybe a bit more quickly now since I just got my time warning. Pinnacle 21 is, everyone knows it probably in some way, shape, or form. I've just had my own experience with it. What I like about it is that it is very useful in some cases. What I really dislike about it is that it's basically a dead end. You get this Excel and it tells you all your problems, and then, you know, what do you do then? And what was great is that I had a call with one of our advisors going through an SCTM data set, and our assumption at the beginning of the call was that we would now then have another list of all the problems that I would have to look into. We actually used the tracer though, so for every message that we got, we looked at how the variable was actually derived, which takes us now like, I don't know, 2 seconds to get that information. And we walked out of that meeting with a very concrete plan of how to fix everything. And so the root cause analysis of trouble that we get out of, well, not trouble, of messages that we get out of P21 is just incredibly accelerated. And so what we're going to do is integrate Pinnacle 21 reports so that you can run through these much more quickly. There are 2 more modules that I have no time to talk about. One is code quality, code validation, and log validation, which, I mean, I'm sure all of you guys review your logs. There's a few cool things that we can do in addition. The other part I sort of hinted at during the demo, which is the results validation. So there's 2 ways of looking at it. One is from the specification side, which is, you know, have you done the individual pieces correctly? The other one is, I would say, more of an integrated idea, which is you look at the results and then you say, well, are they the way I expect? And if not, what could be the problem? And so in results validation, as I showed, we show you the procedures that produce them, the actual results. We show you which variables go into these results. And then you can review these backwards very quickly if you see a problem with them. And again, obviously, everything is traceable. Now, where we're going with this is this idea of validated by Verisian, which is that we give you an analysis fitness score, which is a combination of the specification validation, the results validation, your code quality, and your log quality. And in addition to that, we'll also work on a data fitness score, which is not the same thing as the P21 score, which is based on structure and certain consistency checks. But what we're talking about here is, are the statistical assumptions met, for example, for the tests that you've selected in your data? Are there any outliers? All of that should be automated. You shouldn't actually have to be looking for those. You should just get warnings that there are outliers in certain cohorts. All of that put together will lead to a study integrity score, and what we're trying to do in terms of process is to move from double programming to this idea of validated by Verisian. And well, that's it. Now, in another final application, close to final, it's almost the last one, is that another reason that this traceability is so interesting is that the highest information density of what actually happens in a study is in code. So if you just think theory, if you want to generate documentation out of something, then you should be using the code. There's much more information about the derivation, how everything is connected, what the data means in code than just in the SAP or just in the study plan. So there are many companies now who grab the study plan and the SAP and whatever other documentation, and from there they try to generate submission documentation. I would be against that because what is actually executing is the code. So what we were going to do is to grab that information, add all the information that we get out of the code, and then generate. As I said, the define-xml SDRG, in the implementation guide, it says it's basically derivative information. It's just the same information again. So we will generate those in the first instance. And we will also look into generating first drafts for what the medical writers do, but this is a bit more in the future. Finally, we've had some interesting conversations and a presentation at the FDA, and they encouraged us to move towards this idea of future submissions, first of all, being greater confidence for the sponsors by using this validated by Verisian approach. Obviously, hopefully faster because of the lack of double programming, greater consistency because of the review and the process itself. And this idea of validated by Verisian, what the FDA was suggesting is that for your submission, even though they don't require it, that it actually, if you do this augmented submission, you provide this information, the FDA sort of has to look at it if they have a question. And what they were saying is that this might prevent inquiry response cycles, right? So if they have a question about something very specific, if they either have access to the platform itself, which will be very trivial for us to do, or we generate reports, which I'm not a big fan of. I don't think anyone needs more reports. But if that's what they want, whatever. Then they can, if they have detailed questions, instead of having to go through this cycle of contacting you, they can just look at the code itself or at whatever we generate. So the future, the way we envision it, actually has three components. We didn't talk at all about the builder because we have limited amounts of time. The validator really aims at eliminating double programming, increasing the speed and the quality and the consistency, and giving you confidence pre-submission that the code you wrote and the analysis that you've done are actually correct. The submitter then is going to generate submission documentation from that, which means you have a guaranteed consistency because it is generated out of the code. And because it is automatically generated, hopefully with very little requirements for review, you're always submission ready. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention. This is our team. We've been around for about a year, and I would love to answer any questions. Let me abstract the question because I have to repeat it. So, no, that's fine. So I think the question goes in the direction of how far does the traceability go? Does it include data dictionaries? Does it include code lists? Does it include CRFs eventually? How far can we reach? And basically the answer is that the reason why we started with logs is because it's a really, really easy entry point, right? We don't have to see data. It's very easy for you guys to try out. But of course, what we will do is we expand towards data, and we definitely want to expand towards eCRFs because we want to have end-to-end traceability, literally, from the very beginning to. So we are already working on things like adding code lists, grabbing unique values, so getting the categories, doing the parameter code for the let's say for the non-trivial variables. So these things we're all working on. It's just, you know, depending on, we need some integration then once we move into the eCRF data. But definitely yes.
I just want to take two questions from the validation.
Yeah, can you repeat the first one in a minute, because I'll lose track of it. I can only do one at a time. Small brain. So so the other models, why do people use ChatGPT? Is that the question? Why? I guess it's the most popular one. I mean, so as Richard said, a lot of it is not really correct. Sometimes it generates code that works. One of the reasons why I was very passionate to start on the validator part of this is that it really doesn't matter so much where the code comes from. So it doesn't matter if a person writes it or if ChatGPT writes it and then it gets reviewed and bug fixed. In the end, it's code that executes, that produces an output. The point though, and I think that was one of the questions that was asked here, you still need someone with domain knowledge and actually enough understanding, because it's going to spit out numbers. Like, that's not the problem. You're going to get it to produce numbers. The problem that you have is you need to understand whether or not these numbers are right and they represent what you're wanting it to represent. And I think in that area, the ChatGPTs, even the really big ones, even if they're going to add more reasoning modules, my expectation would be that they will remain to be not very good. Certainly if you ask complicated questions. In software engineering, we see this all the time. If you ask it to write a small function, then probably it's going to be correct. If you ask it to do anything that, you know, includes 3 or 4 reasoning steps and has to be of a meaningful architecture, it's complete rubbish. And so that would be my answer for the first one. For the second one, the spec validation, that's a great point. And of course, if you're, think about sort of information density, like if your specs are very vague, there's very little anyone can do. But this is actually the case also for not using AIs to validate it, right? If the specs are unclear for you as a programmer, well, the specs are unclear. We can't create information out of nowhere, and we can't out of nowhere tell whether or not something is correct. So the question, that is one of the questions why we do, why we would have to look at the specs to see how much information is in there and how good we can be at matching that. So the AI, so the question basically is how can we ensure that whatever AI generates actually is traceable and understandable? And yes, okay. So my answer to that would always be whatever AI does in the background behind ChatGPT, guess what it does? It generates code and executes it. And so you just don't see that. But anything AIs do is they execute code if they actually generate data, right? So what they will do is they will generate code for you, which will then be executed and creates the data. And so that's why we started with this code traceability, because the code, that's what I meant at the beginning, it doesn't matter who generates it. I don't care if you write it or if an AI writes it or you write it together or you write it, you know, 5 people in a room. It's code that executes, that produces an output. And so what we're writing is we grab onto any code and let you review it and basically make sure that you understand it. And I would add to what you said with the traceability that it's just for the regulators to review. Traceability is literally the way that we capture the meaning of the output. And that's the same for you as a programmer, whether you do root cause analysis or you're developing a self, but also obviously in this case, it's for a regulated industry that the regulators have to do it. So my answer to that would be, so the question is, can we use AI to sort of both produce and validate, and how can we, again, make sure that it is producing so we don't train. So what we do is we use a RAG system which provides additional context, and we generate prompts where the information density of the prompts is so dense that it only contains the information that it needs to answer, but it contains all of the information that it needs to answer. And we use largely pre-trained models, but we will now train them on SAS specifics mostly because they are really bad at SAS. Actually, because there's not so much SAS code on GitHub. So what we do is we try to eliminate its weaknesses just in terms of code understanding through training, because that is easily done. And the rest is usually done through prompt engineering and RAG systems. But the point being independent, so this is the thing, like the exact implementation is actually not that important. It doesn't matter if you use ChatGPT 4 or 3.5 or you use the next generation, which is going to have advanced reasoning capabilities. the point is what they're still going to produce is code that executes and produces results. Like this is never going to change ever, because that's how computers work. They generate code, which then executes. And so what we need to do, and this sort of goes back to some of the questions here, is someone still needs to have the oversight and understanding. And the only way that you get that, no matter which version, or if it's today or trained on 2021 data or the latest version, you still need to have the ability to quickly run through and see if the reasoning makes sense or not. Because the problem with all of these systems is that they will generate output and they will generate numbers, and they're written in such a way that they will produce something that looks reasonable, but you don't know that until you've actually looked at it. If there's 6 people looking at it and you have more people looking at it, the probability that 6 different brains come up with the same problems and the same errors is much lower than 2. The way to think about AI is that it's an average across everything that is read. So it's not the most brilliant of us, it's the most average of us. And so the point at which AIs check AIs to produce meaningful output, I hope is still very far away, because we'd be moving backwards. And the way that you ensure that we're moving forwards is that we use it as an augmentation and something that takes away tasks which are trivial, while hopefully giving us enough space to still train our brains so that we can tell the difference between right and wrong. And then we embed that into processes that make sure that we don't push rubbish out. And so airplanes have redundant systems, but the redundant systems individually aren't double programmed. That's a resilience case, that's not a quality control. But let's maybe take the detailed discussion. Okay. All right. Thank you very much.